Hello and welcome to the My Ministry Mission podcast, where I'm taking you on a journey with me from unbeliever to disciple of Christ. As a Christian young in his faith, I'll share with you what I've learned as I seek a position of ministry in my life. I urge you to visit my website at myministrymission.com and to find me on Facebook at facebook.com/myministrymission. My name is Jason, and this is My Mission. Welcome back to the My Ministry Mission podcast, or if you're new here, just welcome. I hope the last 2 weeks have been filled with wonderful lessons and blessings. In my last episode, I gave you an overview and some history on the book of Ruth, and now we'll delve into this short but wonderful story, chapter by chapter. I mentioned that this book is one of my favorites so far, not just because my daughter's middle name is Ruth, but because it's a wonderful lesson in faith, love, hope, hard work, and integrity. It's a story with a very, very honest feelings and illustrates how wonderful God can be even during our darkest hours if we just trust His plan. So I hope you're settled in and ready for a beautiful story. So one thing I failed to include in last episode's summary was the legitimacy of David as king because of Deuteronomy 23 verse 3. Which reads, "No Amorite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation." David was the great-grandson of Ruth, who was a Moabite. Because the people of Moab refused to help the Israelites when they came out of Egypt, the law forbade any descendants of a Moabite to join Israel down to the 10th generation. So the question remains, if Ruth was a Moabite, and they weren't allowed to enter the assembly of the Lord, then how could one of her descendants serve as king? So from my research, there appears to be a common thread that indicates rabbis generally interpreted Deuteronomy 23:3 to apply only to a male Moabite and not the female Moabitess. According to Jewish laws and traditions at that time, curses followed the father, not the mother. So simply put, an Israelite woman could not marry an Ammonite or Moabite man, but a man of Israel could marry a Moabite or Ammonite woman. Now, this is referenced in several of the commentaries, including Benson, Barnes, and Jameson Fawcett Brown, just to name a few. Another explanation I read was that non-Israelite mothers in Israel did not determine the nationality of their offspring. For example, because Joseph had an Egyptian wife, that didn't make their sons Egyptians in Genesis 41:50-52. I wanted to touch on this because I stumbled upon it between last episode and this one, and I kind of wanted to close the loop there. I wanted to make sure that the questions was answered. So with that out of the way, we start this adventure in Ruth 1 verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Now the book of Ruth kicks us off in the days of the judges. Now the final word in the book of Judges was chapter 21 verse 5 with the following. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. This is not good. Instead of living under the will of God and the laws of Moses, everyone was out there doing as they pleased, which isn't the entire theme of Judges. Israelites would turn from God to do as they wanted, do as they pleased. They ended up in bondage. They cried out to God. Then God would rise up a judge to free Israel. The judge would die, and they would eventually go back to doing whatever they wanted and turning their backs on God again, and the cycle would repeat. So back to Ruth verse 1-5 of chapter 1, it explains that they were in the days of when Israel had no king and the judges ruled, and there was a famine in the land, which tells us that Israel was being disobedient, otherwise they would be plentiful. Elimelech and his wife Naomi left from Bethlehem in Judah to the country of Moab, where they had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Now, early on in the chapter, Elimelech dies, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons who married Moabite women. One was named Orpah, and the other was our rising star of the story, Ruth. After living in Moab for 10 years, both of these men also died, and Naomi was left with no husband and no sons. And now all 3 women were childless widows. Being a widow without any children was considered to be a very low station back then. There was nobody there to support them, so they had to live off the generosity of strangers. In verses 6-13, we see that Naomi has decided to go back to Judah, probably because she thought she could survive better there. She tells Orpah and Ruth to go back to their people. Naomi is rather downtrodden during this exchange, saying in verses 11 through 13, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Orpah is convinced to leave, but Ruth clings to Naomi, and we get to enjoy verses 16 and 17, which is one of the most beautiful shows of love and dedication. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." The sense of love and family between Naomi and Ruth is truly wonderful here. Like, Ruth could have easily gone back to her family and would have been probably taken care of and lived a very good life, but she refused. Ruth wasn't just accepting a new home. She was beyond that, to forsake the Moabite gods and to take on the God of Israel. Naomi realizes that Ruth is not going to relent, and the two women go back to Bethlehem. And when they arrive, the whole town reacts to their arrival, and they ask, "Can this be Naomi?" And in Naomi's response, we see more of her despair and doubt in verses 20 and 21. "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Wow, Mara means bitter, literally means bitter. So she's saying that she embodies bitterness, and she blames God for all of those things that happened. Naomi returned to Bethlehem with few material possessions, but the one thing that she did have was an unbelievable blessing: her daughter-in-law Ruth. Now the first chapter closes by telling us they arrived as the barley harvest was beginning, which plays into the events in the next chapter. Now chapter 2 opens with a brief reference to Boaz, who is a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's dead husband. We don't know how they're related, maybe distant relative, but they are related, and this becomes important later. So Ruth chapter 2 verse 1 reads, "Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz." So we learn Boaz is a man of standing. In other verses, it depicts him as a worthy man, or wealthy, prominent, even noble. This is interesting because 10 years prior, Naomi and her family made a choice to leave Bethlehem because of the famine, but the people of Bethlehem did not perish from hunger. They were still there and blessed far more than Naomi's family. Now, this is a bit of a sidebar, but sometimes we justify bad choices because of the circumstances we happen to be in, instead of letting God strengthen us, bless us, and help us make good choices. Moving on to Ruth chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, we see that Ruth is planning to go out into the fields and glean heads of grain, or pick up what others have left behind. Now, this is a reference to Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 10, where God basically commanded the farmers of Israel to not completely harvest their fields, but leave something for the poor. If they drop a bundle of grain, they're to leave it there. It reads as follows: "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleans of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreign. I am the Lord your God." Now let's put a pin in that for a moment. Now we know that Ruth is going to see if she can collect some grain, but we're going to shift to Boaz for just a moment. In verse 4 it reads, "Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. 'Lord be with you. The Lord bless you,' they answered." We see a hint of Boaz's character here in verse 4. Now moving on to verses 5 through 7, Boaz takes notice of Ruth and asks his overseer who she is. Now the overseer explains that she is the Moabite woman who returned with Naomi and has asked to glean and gather sheaves behind the harvesters. Ruth could have quoted from Leviticus 19, but she didn't. She asked for the right to gather in his field, which shows that she is humble. The overseer also reported that she had been there all day, which shows that she is a determined and hard worker. Boaz speaks kindly to Ruth in verses 8 and 9. "So Boaz said to Ruth, 'My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." God guided Ruth to Boaz, so we already see blessings on her. And Boaz was offering her even more blessings by having her stay in the fields and work alongside the other women who would tie together the cut stalks of grain. By doing this, Boaz was offering her a few things. First, companionship with the other young women, protection by ordering his men to leave her alone and putting her in a safe environment in his fields, and then refreshment by allowing her to drink from the jugs whenever she was thirsty. This is a wonderful show of kindness towards Ruth, and his kindness was authentic because at this point, Boaz has nothing to gain from Ruth other than another pair of hands in the field. And Ruth's response was one of humility. At this, in verse 10, it reads, "At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, 'Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?'" This might be a similar question that we would all ask. Why are you being so nice to me? Sheer gratitude from her. She doesn't expect anyone to notice her. She never complains about the hardships that have fallen upon her and Naomi. Ruth is a Moabite, a foreigner, and I'm sure this weighed heavily on her mind a lot living with the Israelites. But this makes Boaz's kindness even more precious and more godly. So why is Boaz doing all of this? I think we get the answer in verses 11 and 12. Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you have come to take refuge." Wow, Ruth stands as an example of what godly women should look like, and Boaz has noticed all of it. She put her trust in God, the God of Israel. She left her family, her God, and her nation. She came to live with strangers. She's a humble servant. She found protection under the wings of God, and she showed kindness to her mother-in-law and took care of her. In verses 14 through 16, Boaz continues to favor Ruth. He offers her bread dipped in wine vinegar, roasted barley grains, even gives her extra sheaves and lets her pull stalks from the bundles and leaves. This may have even been the beginning of romance. Boaz went far beyond the commandments of Leviticus 19. Ruth ate until she was satisfied and set aside the rest. Afterwards, Ruth went back into the fields and worked until the sun set. She was blessed, but Ruth was a hard worker, and at the end of the day, she had about they call it a faf, which is about 5.5 gallon tub of barley. Not bad for a day's work. Ruth returned to Naomi with all of this barley, plus the leftovers from her meal with Boaz, and suddenly we see a different side of Naomi. Look at verse 19. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. Now we have a bit of a plot twist. In verse 20, we find out that being a relative of Elimelech provides a unique opportunity here. Verse 20 reads, "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead," she added. "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Okay, so that's interesting. A guardian redeemer is also called a kinsman redeemer. It was a close and influential relative who took on the responsibility of helping another relative in need or in danger. The role of a kinsman redeemer included buying a fellow Israelite out of slavery, Leviticus 25:48. They were responsible for being the avenger of blood for a murdered family member, Numbers 35:19. They would buy back family land that had been forfeited, Leviticus 25:25. And in the case of Ruth, they carry on the family name by marrying a childless widow, Deuteronomy 25:5-10. Basically, it was Boaz's right to marry Ruth because he was related to Elimelech. And chapter 2 closes with Naomi telling Ruth to go with the women who worked for Boaz because it was safe. So Ruth continued to work in his fields until the harvest finished, while she lived with Naomi. Chapter 3 opens with Naomi trying to set up Ruth. In verses 1-4, she tells Ruth her plan. Let's look. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with the women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and put on perfume and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he finishes eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." So basically, Naomi's plans consist of get cleaned up, get dressed up, uncover his feet, and lie down. That's basically it. Now, I feel like dating has come a long way since those days, but before we dive into this too far, let's talk about the threshing floor. So the threshing floor was a flat, smooth surface used during grain harvesting as a process to separate the wheat from the chaff, or basically separating the grains from the useless straw. This typically involved a sledge or a grinder wheel attached to the heavy hooves of oxen that was used to crush the crop under the weight of the sledge. Once it was ground down, the mixture was tossed into the air, and the light parts, the straw, would blow away and allow the seeds to fall and be collected on the ground. So the valuable part would fall down, and you would save it, and the rest of it, the part that was not valuable, would blow away. Now, the threshing floor is where the most valuable part of the crop was exposed. It was known as a place of intentional destruction and often seen as a place of separation and revelation. The threshing process is a picture or a metaphor of worship where God's provision for us is exposed. All we have to do is honor him with bounty of what is revealed. The threshing floor is also a symbol of judgment, often in terms of heaven and hell, like in Psalm 1:4. "Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away." Now, Naomi wanted Ruth to go down to the threshing floor, wait for Boaz to finish tending his barley, and then lie down for the night at Boaz's feet. This is a way to demonstrate to Boaz that Ruth longed to be redeemed by him. Naomi was asking Ruth to let Boaz judge her as worthy. Would Ruth be seen as the valuable seed that was coveted and wanted, or would Boaz let her blow away in the wind like the useless chaff? Naomi is asking Ruth to put herself out there and be extremely vulnerable here. Ruth obediently does what she is asked to do. In verse 5-8, she went to the threshing floor, waited for Boaz to finish his meal, and then laid down at the end of a grain pile. Or when he lay down at the end of the grain pile, Ruth made herself known to Boaz and laid down at his feet. When Boaz asks, "Who are you?" in verse 9, Ruth responds, "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are guardian redeemer of our family." This was a cultural reference. By spreading the garment over her, he would be agreeing to marry her. It's symbolic of him agreeing to take her under his protection. God uses the same terminology in Ezekiel 16:8. "Later I passed by, and when I looked at you, I saw that you were old enough for love. I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your naked body. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine." We have Ruth putting everything on the line, handing her entire future over to Boaz, and how does he respond? There's a bit of a plot twist in verses 10-13. Let's read. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether richer or poor. Now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you as you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer for your family, there is another who is more closely related. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he is not willing to, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." Boaz is a man of integrity, a man of God. He is not going to cut corners and try to cheat the system. He knows he is not first in line, and even though he wants to exercise his right to marry Ruth, he will not do it under false pretense. Boaz will do it according to God's will, according to God's way. Boaz and Ruth spend some time together, and then she leaves in the morning before someone can recognize her. Now, Boaz does tell her in verse 14, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor, which at first glance seems a bit suspicious. They're not trying to hide anything scandalous. Boaz doesn't want the other kinsmen to know that Ruth came to him first before he has a chance to talk to him. Ruth is gifted more barley, so she won't return to Naomi empty-handed. Boaz he's a proper gentleman here in this chapter, and it's filled with romantic tension and this beautiful imagery and symbolism. I think it's safe to say that Boaz and Ruth are falling in love with each other, and only one thing stands in their way: the other kinsman redeemer. So now we reach the final chapter in the book of Ruth, chapter 4. Boaz has set off to do the right thing and go talk to the legitimate first-in-line kinsman redeemer. Let me read Ruth 4, verses 1 through 4. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer that he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they also did. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling a piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggested that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me so I will know, for no one has the right except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Okay, the gate was basically where the city council was found and where business was generally conducted. So Boaz headed up there to the gate to meet with the kinsman redeemer, or the guardian redeemer, and 10 of the elders. I think it's interesting that the author of Ruth never identified who this other man was. Probably because he was not worthy of mention. I mean, is it possible that this speaks to the man's character, the stranger's character? Maybe. Boaz states the facts. There is a piece of land that Naomi is selling, and this unknown redeemer is first in line to claim it. The stranger accepts the offer, but then this happens in verses 5 and 6. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." So now the offer extends from just straight land grab into inheriting Ruth as a wife. Now this is an obligation of the kinsman redeemer. Take the land, take the wife as well. By accepting this offer, the stranger was obligated to take care of Ruth. But why Ruth and not Naomi? Well, Naomi was beyond childbearing years, and the kinsman redeemer had no expectation to marry her, but Ruth was not. But why did the man refuse now that Ruth was on the table? From what I've read and what I understand in the commentaries, it's possible this man had grown sons that had already received their inherited land, and bearing a child with Ruth would have complicated it quite a bit. Plus, if he's already married, bringing home Ruth as wife number 2 might have been a bit awkward. This is a glorious moment for Boaz. And as was customary, in order to finalize the deal, one man would take off a sandal and give it to the other, which is precisely what the stranger did. Boaz makes it official through a declaration in verses 9 and 10. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witness that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among the family or from his hometown. Today you are witness." The witnesses confirmed his declaration and offered Boaz a blessing in return. The happy ever after comes in verses 13 through 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Boaz took on the role of kinsman redeemer and saved Ruth and gave her a joyful life even after she and Naomi had lost so much in Moab. This is a picture of Jesus, where Boaz became the kinsman redeemer for Ruth. Jesus became the kinsman redeemer for all of us. And then Ruth gave birth to Obed, who fathered Jesse, who fathered David, which will eventually take us to Mary and then to Jesus Christ. If Boaz and Ruth didn't get together and have Obed, the genealogy of Jesus Christ would not have come to be. Oftentimes, things happen in our lives that rattle us, cause us to question our beliefs like Naomi did. Ruth had an unshakable faith in God and was willing to give up everything for that faith. Ruth eventually found love and married Boaz, so she was blessed by God for her faith, but Ruth would not have known that she was part of God's plan to save all of us. We don't always understand God's plan, and sometimes we never will, but Ruth and Boaz taught us that complete trust and faith and obedience to God has its rewards. I've really enjoyed doing this podcast, and I will continue to do it, so don't think this is the start of a goodbye speech. However, I'm not terribly happy with the format. I enjoy the research and the learning I do as I prepare for these episodes, but I'm not sure this is the content I really want to get out there. I might still do episodes like this, but I also want to speak more about how God is working in the world around me in my life and share my experiences and try to connect those experiences to Scripture where I can. I want to provide more guidance for new Christians and really grow the audience more under that mission. I'm not sure how this will all get started or what it's going to look like yet. I'm still kind of rolling it around in my brain, but I do hope to bring you more content that's closer to home by sharing what's going on in my world a bit more. And so stay tuned. I'm determined to take this podcast up a notch. Thank you again for listening to this episode. If you have any questions or comments, I urge you to visit my website at myministrymission.com. You can click the contact button, or you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/myministrymission. Remember to pray and remember to love God and each other. My name is Jason, and this is my mission.